The Alpha King replaced me before sunrise, and by noon, I had already disappeared. The words slipped through Elena's mind as she stood at the edge of the glass terrace, one hand resting on the slight curve beneath her dark sweater, the other wrapped around the cold iron railing. Below her, the palace gardens shimmered in the morning light, all polished stone, trimmed hedges, and white roses bending under a soft wind that felt almost too gentle for a place built on power. She should have felt safe here. She had once believed this palace would become home. Instead, it had become the place where people lowered their voices when she walked by, where servants looked away, where court ladies smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. And now, it had become the place where her name was being quietly erased. She heard the footsteps before she saw him. Adrian Sterling moved with the same calm precision he used in boardrooms and council halls, every step measured, every gesture controlled. The Alpha King did not need to raise his voice to command a room. He only needed to enter it. Elena turned as he approached, and for one brief second, she let herself look at the man she had loved long before the crown, long before the palace, long before anyone else had begun calling him His Majesty. He did not meet her eyes for long. That hurt more than anger ever could. "The staff will arrange a suite for you in the East Wing," he said, his tone steady, almost courteous. Almost distant. Elena's fingers tightened around the railing. "A suite," she repeated softly, tasting the word like something stale. Adrian's jaw shifted, just once. Behind him, through the open doors, Elena caught a glimpse of movement in the corridor, a flash of silk, a familiar laugh, and then the woman stepped into view as if she had every right to be there. Vivian Hart. Bright, elegant, glowing with the easy confidence of someone who had never once been asked to leave. One hand rested protectively over her own stomach, and the small smile on her lips carried the kind of certainty Elena had spent years trying not to notice. Adrian's attention shifted to Vivian before Elena could even blink. It was not dramatic. It was not cruel in the obvious way. That was somehow worse. It was instinct. It was habit. It was the silent truth of a man who had already chosen where to stand. Elena felt the room narrow around her, the air thinning at the edges. Vivian looked at her with a pleasant, practiced expression. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said sweetly, though her eyes said otherwise. Adrian did not correct her. He simply stepped aside, making space for Vivian at his shoulder as if the movement had been decided long ago. Elena looked from one to the other, and something inside her went very still. Not broken. Not yet. Just still, like a lake before the wind comes. She understood then, with a clarity that made her chest ache, that she was no longer standing in the center of his life. She had become an inconvenience, a memory, a woman to be managed carefully until she could be set aside without scandal. And Adrian, the man who once whispered that he would never let her feel alone, was now watching her as if he had already moved on to a future she was not part of. "You should rest," he said quietly, as though his kindness could soften what had already been done. Elena almost laughed. Instead, she nodded once, because pride was the only thing left that no one had taken from her yet. She walked past him without touching his hand, past Vivian without offering a smile, and down the long corridor lined with portraits of former kings and queens who had all learned, in their own time, what it meant to be replaced. By the time she reached the room the staff had prepared, Elena's decision was no longer a thought. It was a pulse. A steady, certain beat beneath her ribs. She would not beg to stay. She would not cry where they could hear her. And she would not give them the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. At the window, she placed a hand over her stomach again, her breath trembling just once. "You and I," she whispered to the quiet room, "are leaving this place tonight." By sunset, the palace had begun to feel like a stranger pretending to be home. Elena moved through the west corridor with one hand pressed lightly to her stomach, her steps measured and quiet, as if even the floor beneath her might betray her if she moved too quickly. The staff had left a small tray outside her door, untouched tea cooling beside a plate of fruit she had no appetite to eat. Inside the room, the curtains shifted with the evening breeze, and the golden light fell across the bed she no longer trusted to sleep in. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the distant sounds of the palace preparing for dinner, silverware being set, voices drifting through open arches, laughter from people who had already chosen a side. Then there was a knock. Elena turned. The door opened before she could answer, and Lila slipped inside with a worried expression and a folded shawl in her hands. "I brought this," she said softly, glancing toward the hall before closing the door behind her. Elena did not take the shawl right away. She only watched her friend, studying the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept shifting as though she feared being caught standing on the wrong side of something dangerous and invisible. "You should not be here," Elena murmured. Lila gave a small, sad smile. "Neither should you." The words landed between them like a truth no one else in the palace had been willing to speak aloud. Elena looked away first. Her throat tightened, but she refused to let that happen in front of anyone, even someone who cared. Not tonight. Maybe not ever again. She walked to the window and stared out at the courtyard below, where lanterns were already glowing one by one along the marble paths. From this height, the kingdom looked peaceful. Soft. Almost merciful. But Elena knew better now. Beauty could hide 1,000 betrayals if it wanted to. "Has he said anything?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Lila hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. Elena closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again when she heard the faint rustle of fabric behind her. Lila had come closer, holding out the shawl as though warmth could solve what words could not. "There are rumors," she whispered. "They say he has been meeting with the council more often than usual. They say the announcement may come before dawn." Elena let out a slow breath through her nose. So it was true. Not the replacement itself. She had already felt that in her bones. No, the true wound was that everything would be made official in daylight, under polished chandeliers and polite smiles, while she was expected to stand there and smile through the ending of her own life as if it were nothing more than a ceremony. She took the shawl at last, not because she needed it, but because Lila's hands were shaking too badly to keep it out any longer. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Lila crossed her arms, then unfolded them again as if she could not decide what to do with her own fear. "Elena, if you are thinking about leaving tonight, you need to be careful. The east gate is watched. The servants speak. If they suspect anything, they will tell him." At that, Elena gave a faint, humorless smile. Let them. It was not defiance born from strength. It was something quieter. Something harder. The kind of calm that comes after a heart has already broken once and decided it would not break in public again. She folded the shawl over her arms and moved toward the dressing table, where a single candle flickered beside a silver brush and a box of pearl pins she would no longer wear. In the mirror, her reflection looked too still. Too pale. A woman standing at the edge of her own erasure. Lila watched her carefully. "Where would you go?" she asked. Elena did not answer at first. Her hand drifted back to her stomach, protective and absent at once. She had not told many people. Not yet. The secret felt too fragile to place into careless hands. But Lila was not careless. Lila had been the only one who had looked at her today without pity. "Somewhere quiet," Elena said at last. "Somewhere no one knows my name." Layla swallowed hard. That does not sound like a plan. Elena's eyes lifted to the mirror again, and this time her reflection did not look defeated. It looked resolute. Tired, yes. Frightened, yes. But resolved. It is enough for tonight. Outside, the first bell for evening supper rang through the palace. Deep. Formal. Final. Elena listened to it fade, then set the shawl down with careful hands and reached for the small leather case hidden behind the mirror. Inside were a few folded papers, 2 banknotes, and the little silver charm her mother had once given her when she was a girl and believed the world could still be kind. She closed the case and held it to her chest for one steadying second before slipping it into her bag. Lila drew in a breath when she understood. "You really are going," she said. Elena nodded once. "Before they can ask me to remain where I am no longer wanted." The words were soft, but they carried farther than she intended. Even so, neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Lila stepped forward and hugged her tightly, careful, trembling, almost as if she were afraid Elena might vanish if held too long. Elena closed her eyes. For one brief second, she let herself feel it. The kindness. The grief. The ache of being seen too late. When they parted, Lila brushed a tear from her cheek and whispered, "If you are ever able, send word." Elena gave the smallest nod. Then she turned away before her courage could fail, crossed the room, and opened the side door that led to the service stairwell. Cold air rose from below, carrying the scent of stone, rain, and night. She paused on the threshold, one hand on the frame, the other over her stomach again. Her life in the palace was ending quietly, but endings were only dangerous when they were mistaken for defeat. Elena stepped into the darkness with her shoulders straight and her silence intact, already choosing the shape of the woman she would become when no one was left to replace her. Elena did not go far at first. She only followed the service stairwell until the palace lights softened behind her and the noise of the upper halls faded into a low, distant murmur. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because her body was weak, but because every inch away from that place carried the weight of what she was leaving behind. The corridor below was narrow and cold, lined with old stone that held the chill of night even in summer. Somewhere above her, music still drifted through the walls, faint and elegant, as if the palace had never noticed she was gone. She pressed a hand to her stomach and kept walking. There was no dramatic farewell. No one followed her. No one called her name. That silence hurt more than words ever could. At the bottom of the stairs, a side exit opened into a narrow courtyard where the wind moved through the hedges in soft, restless waves. A single lantern swayed near the gate, throwing weak gold across the gravel path. Elena pulled her coat tighter around herself and stood still for one breath, looking back at the palace windows glowing high above her. They looked warm from a distance. They were not warm. Not to her. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. She took it out, expecting another message she did not want to read, but the screen showed only a name she had not heard in years. Mara. Elena stared at it, her pulse quickening. Mara had once been the only woman in the palace kitchen who spoke to her like she was human. The call came again, and this time Elena answered. "Elena?" Mara's voice was low, careful, and instantly urgent. "If you are still there, do not go through the East Road." Elena did not speak at first. A cold unease settled under her skin. "Why?" she asked softly. There was a pause, the sound of breathing, then a quiet exhale. "Because someone is waiting there for you. And I do not think they came to help." Elena closed her eyes. For a moment, the night seemed to narrow around her. Every instinct in her body told her to turn back, to retreat into the empty corridor and pretend she had never tried to leave. But that was the old Elena, the one who waited for permission, the one who made herself smaller so others could feel large. That woman had been left behind in a room full of silken lies. This one only tightened her grip on the phone and asked, "Who is it?" Mara hesitated. "I do not know his name. But he has been asking about you for the past hour." Elena's fingers went cold around the device. "Asking what?" "Whether you had already gone. Whether you were alone." The words landed like a quiet alarm. Elena lifted her gaze toward the dark path beyond the courtyard, where the shadows under the trees looked deeper than they should have. The wind moved across the gravel, shifting the lantern light in small trembling patterns. She was suddenly aware of how open the space felt, how exposed. Every sound seemed too loud. Every silence seemed to wait. "Elena," Mara said gently, "listen to me. Go somewhere safe. Do not let anyone see your face if you can avoid it. Elena almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. Safe. The palace had taught her that safety was often just another word for obedience. She ended the call with a quiet thank you and slipped the phone away. Then she stood very still, listening. At first, there was nothing but wind. Then, from beyond the hedge line, came the soft crunch of a shoe on gravel. Elena did not move. Another step followed. Slow. Measured. Intentional. Her breathing changed, shallow and careful, as if the night itself had become something that could hear her. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see the edge of a figure near the gate, half hidden by the lantern's weak glow. He was not close enough for her to make out his face, but there was something in the way he stood that made her skin tighten. Not casual. Not lost. Waiting. Elena kept her hand over her stomach and took one quiet step backward, then another, moving without hurry so she would not draw attention. The figure did not call out. He simply lifted his head, as though he already knew she was there. And in that instant, Elena understood that leaving the palace had only brought her to the threshold of a different kind of danger, one that was patient enough to wait in the dark and confident enough to believe she would come to it eventually. The figure near the gate had not moved, and that unsettled Elena more than if he had stepped forward at once. Silence, she had learned, could be a kind of pressure. It pressed against the skin. It filled the gaps between heartbeats. It made a woman feel as though every breath she took belonged to someone else. Elena stayed just outside the lantern light, one hand over her stomach and the other hidden inside the fold of her coat, fingers curled so tightly they ached. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of wet stone and pine from the edge of the grounds. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain kept whispering into the dark, soft and steady, as if the world beyond the palace had no idea how close she was to becoming a memory inside it. Then the figure shifted. Only slightly. But it was enough for her to see the outline of broad shoulders and the glint of a silver ring catching the light. Not a guard. Not a servant. Someone with the stillness of a man who expected obedience without asking for it. Elena felt her pulse tighten. She did not know him, and yet something about the angle of his head made her uneasy, as if he were not waiting by chance but because he had been told exactly where she would appear. "You are leaving early," he said at last. His voice was calm, almost polite, and that made it worse. Elena did not answer. She had already spent too many hours being pulled into conversations she had never chosen. Tonight, she had no interest in giving anyone her fear. She lifted her chin a fraction and kept her eyes on the shadow beside the gate. "Move," she said quietly. The man gave no reaction at first. Then he let out the smallest sound, not quite a laugh, not quite surprise. "You are in no position to issue commands." Elena felt the words settle over her like a cold cloth. In another life, perhaps, she would have flinched. Perhaps she would have lowered her gaze and explained herself, asked permission, apologized for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the version of her that had remained in the palace was already gone. The woman standing in the dark no longer belonged to anyone who thought they could name her future. She tightened her coat around her and took one careful step back, measuring the distance to the service path behind her. "Then consider this not a command," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, but a warning. "I am leaving, and I will not be persuaded to stay." The figure tilted his head, watching her with a patience that felt deliberate. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Then, from somewhere deeper in the grounds, a door closed with a soft, final sound. Elena turned instinctively toward it, and when she looked back, the man was no longer where he had been. The space beside the gate stood empty, yet the feeling of being watched did not leave with him. It only spread, quiet and cold, across the dark like mist over water. Elena swallowed hard. Her stomach tightened under her palm, and for a brief second she wondered if she had imagined the entire encounter. But the gate was still ajar. The lantern still flickered. And the path beyond it still led out, if she was brave enough to keep walking. So she did. One step. Then another. Not quickly. Not blindly. Just enough to keep moving forward while every instinct told her that the night had not finished with her yet. Halfway down the service path, she heard footsteps behind her again. This time they were farther away, but unmistakably present, following at a measured distance that made her skin prickle. Elena did not turn around. She could feel her breath growing shallow, but she forced it slow, one careful inhale at a time. If someone wanted her afraid, then fear would not be the thing that made her stop. The gravel under her shoes shifted softly as she crossed into the lower garden, where the hedges rose higher and the moonlight thinned between the branches. There, in the dim silver wash, she saw it. A carriage had been left waiting near the outer wall, dark and unmarked, the kind that did not announce itself to anyone who was not meant to notice. No driver stood beside it. No lantern shone from within. It looked abandoned at first glance, but Elena knew better than to trust what appeared harmless in the dark. She stopped just short of the wheels, her pulse now beating in her throat. This was no accident. Someone had arranged this path. Someone had expected her to choose it. The realization settled over her with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She had not escaped the palace. She had only stepped into the first part of whatever was waiting beyond it. And still, even with the strange carriage ahead of her and the footsteps fading behind, Elena lifted her chin and moved closer, because there are moments when a woman discovers that survival is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is a hand held over a beating heart. Sometimes it is the decision to keep going when the dark seems to know your name. The carriage door stood open as if it had been waiting for her all along. Elena stared at the dark interior, feeling the cold gather around her ankles, then rise slowly, as though the night itself had a pulse. Behind her, the palace was only a distant glow now, soft and golden and unreachable. Ahead, there was nothing she could trust except the thin, steady rhythm beneath her palm. She pressed her hand more firmly to her stomach and took a careful breath. The silence around the carriage felt deliberate, almost watchful. Not empty. Not safe. But deliberate. That was worse. A woman did not need years of court life to understand the danger of being expected somewhere. She had spent enough of her life being moved, placed, and spoken over to recognize the shape of someone else's plan. Still, she lifted one foot onto the step. The leather beneath her shoe was smooth, expensive, recently cleaned. Someone powerful had prepared this with care. The realization made her shoulders tighten. No one did anything this neatly without wanting something in return. Elena paused with her fingers on the doorframe and looked back once toward the palace. For a brief second, she could almost imagine the windows lighting up behind her, imagine a voice calling her name, imagine someone realizing too late that she was gone. But the moment passed without a sound. No one came. No one called. The emptiness of that silence was its own answer. So she climbed inside. The carriage held the faint scent of cedar and old paper, with a trace of something sharper beneath it, like rain on stone. Elena sat on the far side of the seat and kept her back straight, even as the walls seemed to close in around her. The door shut with a soft, final click. Not a slam. Worse than a slam. A decision. For a few heartbeats, nothing moved. Then the carriage gave a small shift, barely felt, and began to roll forward. Elena's breath caught. Where was she being taken? Who had known she would leave tonight? And why had the carriage been waiting in darkness, as though her arrival had already been written into someone else's evening? She turned her head toward the narrow window, but the glass was too dim to offer more than blurred shadows. Lanterns passed like distant stars, then disappeared. The road beneath them smoothed into a rhythm that sounded almost gentle, which only made the fear settle deeper in her chest. Gentle things had often hidden the sharpest edges. She knew that now. She sat very still, listening to the wheels and the quiet, letting one thought carry her through the dark. She would not panic. She would not beg. She would not let fear make her small again. If this was a trap, then she would learn its shape. If this was a test, then she would survive it. And if someone had sent this carriage believing she would arrive broken and grateful, they were about to discover how wrong they were. Elena lowered her gaze to the faint outline of her hand in the moonlight and found herself thinking, not for the first time, that endings were only final for people who surrendered to them. The road turned. The carriage leaned slightly. Somewhere beyond the glass, the night opened wider, and with it came the unsettling sense that she was moving not away from her fate, but straight toward it. The carriage rolled deeper into the night, and Elena kept her hand resting over her stomach as though that small circle of warmth could anchor her to the world she still knew. The road outside the window was barely visible now, only a pale ribbon under the moonlight, flanked by dark trees that watched without blinking. She had expected fear to come in waves, sharp and wild, but what settled over her instead was something quieter and far more unsettling, the feeling that every mile was carrying her farther from a life she had once mistaken for safety. The thought of the palace made her chest tighten, not because she missed its walls, but because she had lived there long enough to understand how easily a beautiful place could become a cage when the people inside it stopped seeing you as human. She turned her face slightly toward the glass, watching her reflection drift over the dark, and for a moment she barely recognized the woman staring back. There was no softness in her eyes now, no hopeful waiting. Only caution. Only the hard, patient stillness of someone who had learned not to waste her breath on promises. The carriage slowed once, then continued, and Elena noticed the change immediately. The wheels moved more carefully now, the rhythm measured, deliberate. Someone was guiding them away from the main road. Her pulse tightened, but she did not move. She simply listened. That was what survival had taught her first. Not trust. Not surrender. Listen. Through the thin wall of the carriage, she caught the faint sound of another horse somewhere ahead, then the soft murmur of a voice too low to understand. Not a threat. Not yet. But enough to make her sit straighter. The carriage eventually stopped beside what sounded like a large wooden gate, and after a long pause the door opened. Cool night air swept in, carrying the scent of wet earth and smoke. Elena did not rush toward the opening. She looked first, taking in what little the moon allowed her to see. A narrow drive. Tall hedges. Stone pillars fading into shadow. Not a prison, exactly. Something older. Something waiting. A man stood near the gate with his head slightly bowed, his posture so still it made the air around him feel carefully arranged. He did not speak at once, and Elena found that silence from a stranger could be more revealing than 1,000 words. He was dressed plainly, almost too plainly for someone who clearly belonged here, and that detail made her wary in a way she could not explain. Nothing about this place felt accidental. Nothing about this night had felt accidental. Miss Elena, he said at last, his voice calm and respectful. You have arrived safely. Safely. The word sounded delicate, almost misplaced. Elena held his gaze from the shadow of the carriage and asked the only question that mattered. Who brought me here? The man hesitated just long enough to confirm what she already suspected. Someone who believed you deserved a choice, he said. It was not an answer, but it was close enough to make her heart knock once, hard, against her ribs. He stepped aside and gestured toward the gate, where a faint line of light glowed from somewhere beyond the trees. Elena saw no chain, no hand reaching to drag her forward, no command dressed up as kindness. Only an invitation. And somehow that was worse, because invitations could hide intentions more easily than orders ever could. She placed one foot on the ground, then the other, feeling the chill rise through her shoes. The earth beneath her was damp and real. So was the wind against her face. She drew in one breath and looked past the gate, where the shape of a house emerged gradually from the dark, its windows dimly lit, its silhouette quiet and severe. Not a palace. Not a refuge either. Something in between. A place where truths might be spoken softly and still cut deep. The man watched her without pressure, as if he had been instructed not to rush the moment. That, too, unsettled her. Men who hurried women usually had something to hide. Men who waited often had something to prove. Elena lifted her chin and crossed the threshold anyway. The gate closed behind her with a muted thud that did not sound final, only intentional. She continued forward, each step measured, each breath controlled, and with every foot of ground she crossed, she felt the night gathering more closely around her as though the world itself was drawing in to witness what would happen next. Somewhere inside the house, a lamp was lit. Then another. Then another, until a warm path of light stretched toward her through the darkness like a quiet warning and a promise at the same time. Elena stopped at the bottom of the steps, her fingers curling once at her side. She had no idea what waited inside, only that nothing in her life had prepared her for the strange, heavy certainty pressing against her chest now. This was not the end of her story. It was the moment the story decided to stop pretending she could remain invisible. Elena had expected a room full of questions. Instead, the first thing she found was silence so complete it seemed to hush even her breath. The hall beyond the entrance was warm with lamplight, the walls lined with dark wood and pale flowers arranged in careful, deliberate symmetry. Nothing here felt careless. Nothing here felt accidental. A house like this did not open its doors without a reason, and Elena could feel that reason waiting somewhere beyond the light. A woman in a gray dress approached first, her expression measured and unreadable. "Miss Elena," she said softly, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something fragile. "The master of the house asked that you be made comfortable." Comfortable. The word should have reassured her. Instead, it only made her more aware of the way the floor seemed to hold her in place, the way every window reflected a version of herself that looked smaller than she felt. She kept one hand near her stomach and followed the woman down a corridor washed in amber light. No one touched her. No one asked why she had come. That was what unsettled her most. People who asked nothing usually already knew too much. At the end of the corridor, the woman stopped beside a closed door and turned with a small, polite bow. "He is waiting for you inside." Elena stared at the door. The polished brass handle caught the light, bright as a warning. For a moment, she thought of turning back. Of taking the steps two at a time, of disappearing into the night before whatever waited on the other side could name itself. But she had already learned that running did not erase a fate that had begun to follow her. So she drew in a slow breath, steadied her shoulders, and reached for the handle. The door opened soundlessly. Inside was a study lit by firelight and one tall candle on a side table. A man stood near the window with his back to her, broad-shouldered and still, his posture carrying the kind of quiet control that did not need to announce itself. He turned only after she stepped inside, and when he did, Elena felt the air shift. He was older than she had expected, perhaps not by much, but enough to carry the weight of long experience in the set of his face. His eyes were dark and calm, and they moved over her with a steady attention that made her pulse falter. Not in fear. In recognition she did not understand. "You came," he said. His voice was low, smooth, and certain, as if he had never doubted she would. Elena did not answer at once. The fire snapped quietly between them. Outside, wind brushed the windows in soft, distant strokes. At last she said, "You sent for me." A faint look passed over his face then, something like approval, something like relief. "Yes," he said. "Because I needed to know whether you would choose the road on your own, or whether you would keep waiting for permission from people who never meant to give it." Her throat tightened. The words landed too close to the truth. She did not know this man, and yet he spoke as if he had seen straight through every place she had been forced to fold herself smaller. "I do not know who you are," she said carefully. "No," he replied, and there was no offense in it. Only certainty. "Not yet." He took one step toward the table and rested his hand on its edge, his gaze never leaving hers. "But I know who you are, Elena. And I know what was done to make you believe you had no right to ask for more than scraps of kindness. The room seemed to grow quieter around that statement, as if even the fire had paused to listen. Elena felt the last of her practiced composure strain under the weight of his words. She had spent so long surviving that being understood felt almost like a threat. Her fingers tightened against the fabric at her waist. "Why am I here?" she asked. This time, when he answered, his voice carried something deeper than calm. It carried intention. "Because the people who tried to disappear you do not understand the mistake they made." He paused, and in that small silence, Elena felt the night itself leaning closer. "And because if you are willing, I can offer you something they never did." He looked at her then with a steadiness that made her chest ache. "A place where no one speaks over you. No one decides you are less. No one gets to tell you that your life is already written." Elena could not move. The warmth of the fire touched one side of her face, but all she could feel was the weight of his words gathering around the hollow places inside her. A place. A choice. A future that did not begin and end with other people's cruelty. For the first time in a long while, she did not know what frightened her more, the possibility that he was telling the truth, or the possibility that she wanted to believe him. And then, just as she lifted her eyes to his, the study door opened behind her with a soft, measured click, and a second presence entered the room, bringing with it the kind of stillness that made Elena's heart turn cold before she had even looked back. Elena did not speak at first. The second presence in the study had changed the air so completely that even the fire seemed to burn more softly, as if the room itself had learned caution. She kept her hands folded in her lap, one resting lightly over the small, steady life inside her, and tried to steady the trembling in her breath. The man who had entered did not rush to explain himself. He only stood near the doorway for a moment, tall and composed, with the kind of quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. Elena had seen enough false kindness in her life to know that silence could mean many things. Sometimes it meant danger. Sometimes it meant judgment. And sometimes, she was beginning to learn, it meant patience. The first man, the one who had offered her the room, rose from behind the desk and nodded once toward the newcomer. No long introductions followed. No theatrical speech. Just a glance between them that told Elena more than words could have. They knew each other. They trusted each other. That alone made her uneasy, because trust had never been something given freely in her world. It had always been a currency other people spent without asking her permission. The man by the door finally stepped farther into the room. His gaze moved to Elena, not with hunger or pity, but with an unsettling kind of recognition, as if he was not looking at a stranger at all. "You have been carrying fear for too long," he said, his voice calm and even. "It is showing in everything you do." Elena's fingers tightened in her lap. She had expected questions about where she had come from, who had sent her, what she knew. Instead, he spoke as though he already understood the shape of her pain. That made her more guarded, not less. People who understood too much often wanted something in return. She lifted her chin, though her throat felt tight. "I did not come here to be studied," she said quietly. The first man almost smiled, but not in mockery. In relief, perhaps. As if her answer confirmed something he had been waiting to hear. The newcomer inclined his head, accepting her words without argument. "Good," he said. "Then let us begin again." The phrase landed in the center of the room like a soft bell. Elena looked from one man to the other, searching for the trap hidden beneath the gentleness, but none came. Instead, the older of the two gestured toward the chair across from the desk. "Sit," he told her. "If you wish. Or do not. No one here will force you." The promise was so simple it almost hurt. Elena remained where she was for a long moment, listening to the crackle of the fire, the distant hush of the house settling around them, the faint rhythm of her own pulse. "No one will force you." She had heard words like that before, always followed by a demand, a condition, a price she did not understand until it was too late. But there was something different here. Something in the way neither man moved to fill the silence. Something in the way they let her keep it. Slowly, Elena stood. Her knees felt weak, but she did not let them show it. She walked to the chair, sat down, and placed both hands carefully in her lap again. Only then did she look up. The newcomer studied her with a stillness that felt almost reverent, and for one disorienting moment, Elena had the strange sense that she was not sitting before strangers at all, but before the edge of a truth she had not yet earned the right to hear. "Why am I here?" she asked at last. The room seemed to hold its breath. The first man leaned one hand on the desk, considering her with unexpected gentleness. "Because someone has finally decided to look after your future," he said. The words should have sounded impossible. Instead, they made Elena feel the first flicker of something she had not allowed herself to name in years. Hope was a dangerous thing. It asked to be trusted before it proved itself worthy. She swallowed hard and looked down, gathering the courage to ask the question that had been pressing against her since the carriage door first opened. "And what does that mean for me?" The newcomer answered before the other could. "It means," he said softly, "that the life they tried to erase is no longer theirs to define." Elena's breath caught. For the first time since she had left the road behind, the fear inside her did not disappear, but it shifted. It made room. And in that narrow, trembling space, something new began to rise. By dawn, the house was no longer quiet in the way a locked room was quiet. It was alive with small sounds that Elena had almost forgotten how to hear: footsteps crossing polished floors, the soft murmur of servants preparing tea, the low crackle of firewood settling in the hearth. She stood by the window with both hands resting over her stomach, watching the pale light spread across the gardens beyond the glass, and for the first time in a long time, she did not feel like someone waiting to be told what came next. The room behind her held that same careful stillness from the night before, but it no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. Protective. A place where her life had been noticed instead of overlooked. When the door opened, she turned at once. The man from the study entered first, carrying a sealed envelope and the measured calm of someone used to delivering truth gently. Behind him came the second presence, the one whose silence seemed to shape the air around him. He was dressed plainly for a man of his bearing, but there was nothing ordinary in the way he moved. Elena had learned, in the span of a single night, that some people did not need to raise their voice to command a room. They simply entered it, and everything else adjusted around them. "You did not sleep," the first man said, not as a question but as an observation. Elena gave a small, tired smile. "I was thinking." "About what?" he asked. She looked down at the envelope in his hand, then at the garden beyond the window, where the morning wind moved through the hedges like a quiet promise. "About what happens when a person is given a future after being told for so long that she has none," she said. The words landed softly, but the room seemed to hear them. The second man near the doorway lowered his gaze, and something in his expression changed, subtle and immediate, as though her answer had reached somewhere private in him. The first man set the envelope on the table beside her. "Then it is time," he said, "that you were given the whole truth." Elena did not move. Not at first. The phrase was simple, but it carried weight. Truth was never simple in houses like this. Truth had edges. Truth could wound before it healed. Yet she felt her pulse steady instead of falter. "I am listening," she said. The first man nodded once and opened the envelope, drawing out several folded pages. "The arrangements made around you were not made to protect you," he said quietly. "They were made to keep you hidden until the right moment. And that moment has come." Elena's breath caught at the word hidden. It was not a word she had expected to hear spoken aloud about her life, not after years of being treated like a mistake someone was embarrassed to name. She looked toward the second man, but he remained near the doorway, his face calm and unreadable, as if the truth he carried was too large to be spoken lightly. "Why now?" she asked. The first man's eyes softened. "Because the child you carry changes everything," he said. Elena's hand went instinctively to her stomach. The room seemed to narrow around that one quiet motion. Not in fear. In recognition. She had spent so long preparing herself for rejection that even kindness felt unfamiliar, almost unreal. But the papers on the table, the careful tone in the room, the way both men regarded her not as a burden but as a person whose life mattered, all of it pressed against the old lie she had lived beneath for too many years. "What are you telling me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The second man finally stepped forward. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a depth that made Elena feel as if he had been watching her story far longer than she understood. "I am telling you," he said, "that the person who replaced you believed he had chosen stability over truth. He thought he could build a future on convenience. He thought your silence meant surrender." Elena's throat tightened. The words did not stun her because they were cruel. They stunned her because they were true. The second man continued, each word measured and clear. He was wrong. The fire popped softly in the hearth. Somewhere outside, a bird called from the garden, bright and brief against the stillness. Elena looked at the pages again, then back at him. "And what about me?" she asked. "What am I meant to do now?" This time, the first man answered. "You decide," he said. "Not them. Not him. Not the people who measured your worth by what they could take from you. You decide what comes next." Something in Elena's chest loosened. Not fully. Not all at once. But enough to let air in. Enough to let her stand a little straighter. For so long, every turn in her life had been made by someone else's hand. Chosen for her. Hidden for her. Taken from her. And now, in the quiet light of morning, the choice had finally been placed back where it belonged. In her own hands. She drew in a slow breath and looked toward the window, where the garden had begun to glow with gold. The life inside her stirred faintly, as if answering the change in the room. Elena placed both hands over that small movement and closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them again, there was no trembling left in her gaze. "Then I will choose truth," she said. The second man watched her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than before, almost reverent. "That," he said, "is exactly why we came to you first." Elena did not know what waited beyond that morning. She only knew that the woman who had arrived here in silence was not the same woman who now stood beside the window with the sun on her face and her future no longer buried beneath someone else's decision. The house remained quiet around her, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of erasure. The silence before a life begins to speak for itself. The morning unfolded slowly, pale and forgiving, as if the house itself had decided to soften around Elena instead of watching her like a stranger. Light spilled across the long hallway in quiet bands of gold, touching the polished wood, the framed portraits, the edges of folded linen carried by servants who lowered their eyes as she passed. No one spoke her name too loudly. No one treated her like a guest to be managed or a problem to be solved. It was such a small mercy that it almost hurt to receive it. Elena moved through the corridor with one hand still resting near her stomach, not because she feared what was inside her, but because the gesture had become a kind of promise. She was here. She was still here. And for now, no one could take that from her. At the end of the hall, the second man who had entered the study the night before stood by a tall window, his dark coat catching the morning light at the shoulders. He turned when he sensed her approach, and there was something steady in the way he looked at her, something that did not ask her to explain herself before offering respect. "You should eat," he said gently, as if he already knew that her strength had been spent somewhere between fear and survival. "The doctor will arrive before noon." Elena hesitated only a moment before giving a small nod. The word doctor should have unsettled her, should have made her think of questions and charts and the cold order of other people deciding what happened inside her body. Instead, all she felt was the faint, cautious relief of being cared for without being cornered. "I am not used to this," she admitted, and the honesty of it made her throat tighten. The man did not smile, but something warm passed across his expression. "No," he said. "I imagine you are not used to being treated as though your comfort matters." The words landed softly, yet they reached the deepest part of her. Elena looked away first, not because she was ashamed, but because she feared that if she met his eyes for too long, she would break under the weight of being seen so clearly. From the dining room beyond, she could hear the quiet arrangement of plates and cups, the delicate clink of porcelain, the restrained movement of people who knew how to keep a household calm. It should have felt ordinary. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a life she had never been allowed to imagine for herself. When they sat her near the window, sunlight warming one side of her face, Elena noticed how carefully every detail had been chosen. The chair had been softened with an extra cushion. The tea was light and fragrant. The bread arrived warm, cut into small pieces so she would not have to ask for anything at all. The kindness in it was almost unbearable. She lowered her gaze to the cup in her hands and watched the steam rise between her fingers. For a while, there was only the sound of the room breathing around her, the murmur of the house coming alive beyond the walls. Then the second man spoke again, his tone quieter now, as if the next words mattered enough to be measured. "There is something you should know before today is over." Elena's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. "About me?" she asked. He looked toward the window first, where the garden beyond was bright with morning, then back to her. "About why you were brought here," he said. "And about the man who sent for you." Elena felt the air change at once. Even before fear fully returned, she understood that whatever had been offered to her so far was only the surface of a much deeper current. Her old life had taught her that every gift came with a price. Every door opened was usually another trap waiting to close. Yet this place was different. The silence was not hostile. The attention was not cruel. It was as though someone, somewhere inside these walls, had already decided that she was no longer to be discarded. Elena set the cup down with careful fingers and looked at the man with quiet resolve. "Then tell me," she said. He studied her for a long, thoughtful moment, as if weighing whether the truth would wound her or free her. At last, he inclined his head. "The one who called you here," he said, "did not do it out of pity." The room seemed to narrow around that single sentence. Elena held her breath, the morning light bright against her skin, and waited for the rest. But the man did not continue. Instead, the sound of footsteps came from the hallway outside the dining room, slow and measured, drawing closer with the kind of certainty that made everyone inside the house grow still. Elena did not know who was coming. She only knew that the air around her had begun to tremble with something larger than fear, and when the footsteps stopped at the doorway, she lifted her head and met the moment that had been moving toward her all along. The man in the doorway did not hurry. He did not need to. He entered the dining room with the kind of quiet authority that made every servant lower their gaze at once, as if the air itself knew better than to stand in his way. Elena rose from her chair before she fully understood why, her pulse steadying only when she saw that he was older than she had expected, composed in a way that made his presence feel less like a threat and more like a verdict being delivered at last. His eyes moved to her cup, to the untouched breakfast, to the careful way she held herself as though she still expected the floor beneath her to vanish. Then, unexpectedly, his expression softened. "You have been carrying too much alone," he said. The words were so plain that they caught her off guard. Elena looked at him, unsure whether kindness from a stranger was another test. But before she could answer, he placed a folded document on the table between them. Not a decree. Not a summons. Something far more dangerous to the old order that had ruled her life. Her name was written on the top in formal ink, followed by a line that made her breath stop: temporary protection, full residence, and immediate access to counsel. Elena stared at it, reading the same sentence twice because she could not quite trust what she was seeing. "This is not charity," the man said quietly. "It is restoration." Across the room, one of the servants inhaled sharply and then fell silent again. Elena felt the room change around her. It was subtle, but real. For so long, Every door had opened for her only to close in her face. Every promise had carried a hidden cost. This one did not. Her fingers trembled as they touched the edge of the paper. "Why?" she asked, her voice thinner than she wanted it to be. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the doorway, where the footsteps she had heard moments ago had finally come to rest. The new arrival remained just out of sight, but Elena could feel him there, still and watchful, as if the entire house had grown quiet to make room for him. "Because," the man said at last, "someone has spent years making decisions for you without ever asking what you deserved." Elena's throat tightened. The words did not heal everything at once. Nothing so broken could be fixed with a single sentence. But they reached something deep inside her, something tired and guarded and nearly spent. She thought of all the times she had been told to wait, to endure, to accept less and call it grace. She had done all of that. And still, here she was, being handed a choice. The paper beneath her hand felt warm from the room, solid and real. Outside, the late morning light rested across the windows in pale gold bands, and for the first time since she had entered this house, Elena did not feel like a shadow passing through someone else's life. She felt seen. Not rescued. Not owned. Seen. The man in the doorway spoke again, his voice lowering just enough to draw her closer to the truth without forcing it upon her. "You may stay here as long as you need," he said. "But stay on your own terms." Elena lifted her chin, and for the first time, there was no apology in the movement. Only a small, careful strength she had almost forgotten belonged to her. "Then I will learn what my terms are," she said. A faint glimmer touched the man's face, something like approval, something like relief. And from the doorway behind him, the unseen presence finally shifted, one measured step forward, as if he had been listening long enough to know that this was the beginning of something that would change all of them. Elena did not yet know who he was. She only knew that the silence in the house was no longer empty. It was waiting. And for the first time, she was no longer afraid to answer it. By the time the sun had climbed higher, the house no longer felt like a place built to hold her still. It felt like a place-making room. Elena stood beside the tall window with her hands resting lightly on the frame, watching light spill across the garden in slow gold waves. For the first time in too long, she was not waiting to be told where to stand, what to say, or how small to make herself. The change was not dramatic. It came quietly, like warmth seeping back into cold fingers. A maid had brought her tea without looking startled. Another had set fresh bread on the side table and smiled as if kindness were the most natural thing in the world. Elena had answered both with caution, still half expecting the old ache to return and spoil the moment. But it did not. Instead, there was only a soft, uncertain peace, and with it, the strange, fragile feeling that maybe her life was finally beginning to loosen its grip on the past. She turned at the sound of footsteps in the hall. This time, there was no alarm in her chest. Only awareness. The man from the doorway appeared again, carrying a slim folder beneath one arm and the same composed expression he had worn the day before. He stopped at a respectful distance, as if he understood that trust had to be earned in a room like this. "There is something you should know," he said gently. Elena waited, her fingers curling once against the window ledge. He opened the folder and drew out a set of papers, then set them on the table between them. "The estate in your name has been restored. The records were incomplete, and the mistake should never have happened." Elena stared at him, unable to speak at first. The words settled over her slowly, one by one, until their meaning began to reach the places in her that had been braced for disappointment. Restored. In her name. Not a favor. Not a loan. Not something temporary. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she had to look away, because the relief was almost more painful than the loss had been. "Why?" she asked at last, her voice quiet. "Because it was yours," he said simply. "And because no one has the right to erase what belongs to you." Elena lowered her gaze to the papers, scanning the familiar lines, the dates, the signatures. It was all there, waiting for her as if it had only ever paused. Her hands shook once, then steadied. This time, when she looked up, she did not hide the tears gathering at the edges of her eyes. "I thought that part of my life was gone," she admitted. The man's expression softened, though he did not interrupt. "Some things are taken," he said. "That does not mean they are lost forever." The words stayed with her, quiet and sure. They were not grand. They did not promise miracles. But they carried a weight Elena could feel in her bones. A little later, she walked with him through the side corridor toward the office where the legal papers would be finalized. The house seemed to follow her with its silence, not pressing, not shrinking, simply witnessing. At the top of the stairs, they paused when another figure appeared at the far end of the hall, waiting beside the dark wood railing as though he had been there longer than anyone had noticed. Elena recognized him at once. The man who had listened. The man who had said little and understood too much. He lifted his head when she reached the landing, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breathing deepen. Not pity. Not judgment. Recognition. "I heard what happened," he said. Elena stopped, uncertain for one brief second, then found her footing again. "Then you know the truth," she replied. He nodded once. "I know enough to see that you were never meant to be dismissed." His voice was low, calm, and firm in the way of someone who did not waste words. Elena felt the strange, steadying pull of being understood without having to defend herself. Behind her, the man with the folder said nothing. He did not need to. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. And in that breathless pause, Elena realized that the next part of her life was no longer about surviving what had been done to her. It was about deciding what she would claim for herself. The thought did not make her fearless. But it made her straight-backed. It made her lift her chin. "Then I would like to see the rest of what is mine," she said. The second man's gaze held hers for one quiet beat, and something like approval moved through the space between them. "Of course," he said. "You should begin where it was all hidden." Elena did not yet know what waited in the sealed rooms beyond the corridor, or how much of her past would need to be faced before the future could fully open. She only knew that the house was changing around her, and so was she. And somewhere deep within those old walls, something long buried was beginning to stir toward the light. The last room was not grand, and that was what made it feel sacred. Morning light gathered along the floorboards, soft and steady, touching the walls as if it had finally found a place that deserved to be seen. Elena stood in the doorway for a long moment before she crossed the threshold. Nothing rushed her now. Nothing ordered her forward. The silence around her was different from the silence she had known before. It was not emptiness. It was peace. The room had been left untouched for years, yet it did not feel abandoned. It felt waiting, like the house itself had been holding its breath for her return. When she stepped inside, she found the truth of her life laid out in careful rows, letters sealed and never opened, records preserved with a kind of reverence she had never been shown, and a final document resting beneath a small silver key. Elena reached for it with hands that trembled only once. She did not know what she expected to find. She only knew that her heart had learned how to brace itself, even when hope came quietly. The man from the doorway remained at a respectful distance, his presence steady but unobtrusive. He watched her as someone might watch a dawn they had waited years to witness. Elena broke the seal, unfolded the paper, and read the words in silence. Her name was there. Not as a footnote. Not as an afterthought. It was there in full, bound to an inheritance that had never been lost, only hidden. The room seemed to tilt around her, not from shock, but from the strange and sudden feeling of being placed back into her own life. For so long, others had spoken over her future, divided it, delayed it, and decided it for her. Now the truth stood before her with quiet certainty. Everything that had been taken from her had been waiting to return. She looked up slowly, and the man near the door nodded once, as if he had always known this moment would come. "It was always yours," he said softly. Elena let the words settle in her chest. There was no triumph in them, only a deep and careful justice. She thought of the years spent shrinking herself to survive. She thought of the nights she had learned to be silent so that others could feel large. None of it had erased her. None of it had made her less. The realization did not arrive like lightning. It came like morning itself, patient and unshakable. She was still here. She had always been here. And now the life that had been denied to her was opening, one breath at a time. Elena folded the paper and held it against her heart. Then she crossed the room to the window and looked out at the garden below, where the first flowers of the season had begun to bloom along the stone path. The sight made something warm rise in her throat. Not grief. Not even relief. It was the tender, fragile feeling of becoming whole. Behind her, the man spoke again, his voice low and certain. "There is more, if you want it." Elena kept her gaze on the light for a moment longer before she answered. "I do," she said. And this time, her voice did not shake. It carried. It belonged to her. When she turned back toward the room, there was no fear in her face, only a calm that had been earned in silence and carried forward with grace. She walked toward the door with her head lifted, her future no longer a thing hidden in someone else's hands. The house remained quiet as she passed through it, but now that quiet felt like blessing. It felt like the hush before a promise is spoken and kept. Outside, the morning had deepened into gold, and the air was clear enough to hold forever. Elena stepped into it as if stepping into her own name. And for the first time in her life, she did not look back.